Edmund Greyfield pressed a burning iron rod against the back of a 7-year-old boy and laughed while the child screamed. 14 men in that room laughed with him. They raised their glasses. They called it discipline. They called it necessary. Not one of them looked toward the woman refilling their cups. Not one of them saw her watching. Not one of them understood that by sunrise, every single one of them would be ash. If this story moves you, subscribe, drop a comment with the city you're watching from, and stay with me until the very end. South Carolina Colony, spring of 1701. She did not arrive in chains, screaming. That is what most people assume. That every person who survived the crossing of the Atlantic arrived broken, wailing, shattered beyond repair. And many did. God knows, many did. But Esperanza de Lima arrived in the port of Charlestown, South Carolina, in the spring of 1701, in absolute silence. Not the silence of defeat, the silence of a woman who had already decided something irreversible inside herself somewhere between the coast of Angola and the shore of a land that did not yet know her name. She was 19 years old. She had been a daughter, a sister, a young woman known in her village for the precision of her memory. She could hear a song once and sing it back note for note 3 years later. She could watch a man's face and know before he opened his mouth whether he intended kindness or cruelty. Her mother had called this gift, seeing the soul before the body speaks. On the auction block in Charlestown, she used that gift to study every man who walked past her. And one man stopped. Edmund Greyfield. He was not the largest man there. He was not the loudest. He was dressed simply, almost plainly, which set him apart from the other plantation owners who wore their wealth like armor. He walked down the line of captives with his hands clasped behind his back, and he looked at each person with the calm, unhurried expression of a man selecting furniture. Not cruelty on his face, not excitement. Something colder than both of those things. Indifference. Pure, absolute, practiced indifference to the humanity standing in front of him. He stopped in front of Esperanza. He looked at her hands first, then her eyes. "This one," he said to the auctioneer. He never asked her name. Greyfield Estate sat 40 miles inland from Charlestown, surrounded by rice fields that stretched so far in every direction that on certain mornings the horizon disappeared entirely into low fog, and you could convince yourself the world had no edges. The estate was massive. Over 200 enslaved people worked its fields, its kitchens, its stables, its laundry, its every breathing function. And at the center of all of it, like a spider at the center of a web he had spent 30 years building, was Edmund Greyfield. Esperanza was assigned to the house. She cleaned, she served, she carried, lifted, fetched, and folded. She did all of this without complaint, without visible emotion, and without ever giving Edmund Greyfield reason to look at her twice. This was intentional. From her very first week on the estate, she understood something that would take most people years of suffering to learn. In a place built on surveillance, invisibility was power. The moment a man stopped watching you, you could begin watching him. And so she watched. She watched which overseers drank and when. She watched which field workers were trusted by the others. She watched the patterns of the estate the way a general watches a battlefield, cataloging weaknesses with the patience of someone who understood that timing was everything. She listened at doorways. She memorized schedules. She learned English not in a classroom, but in fragments, stolen pieces of conversation gathered over months, assembled in private like a puzzle built in the dark. By the end of her first year at Greyfield Estate, Esperanza de Lima could understand almost everything spoken around her. By the end of her second year, she could speak it back without accent. She told no one. The Rice Council met on the first Thursday of every month. 14 men, the wealthiest plantation owners in the low country of South Carolina. They arrived on horseback and by carriage, tied their animals at the post near the East Garden, and gathered in the large meeting room on the ground floor of Greyfield's main house. Esperanza served them. Every month, without exception, she carried in the trays, poured the wine, removed the empty dishes, and drifted in and out of the room like smoke, silent and unremarkable. And every month she listened. The things she heard in that room over the course of 15 years would have driven a lesser spirit to madness. These men spoke freely in her presence, the way powerful people speak freely in front of furniture. They discussed the pricing of human beings. They discussed how many bodies a rice field required to be profitable and how to calculate acceptable mortality rates among their workers. They debated the best methods for breaking resistance in newly arrived captives. They laughed about things that had no business being laughed about. One night, a man named Harlan Dutton, a plantation owner from 2 counties over, leaned back in his chair and said, with perfect cheerfulness, "You know the secret to keeping them manageable? Never let them believe they are people. The moment they believe that, your whole operation is finished." The other men laughed and raised their glasses. Esperanza stood in the corner with a tray and said nothing, but her hands were perfectly still. That was the thing about Esperanza de Lima. In moments that should have made her hands tremble, they were completely still. It was in her 3rd year at the estate that she met Wayme. He was a man from the Gold Coast, tall and lean, with serious eyes that reminded Esperanza of her father. He worked the eastern rice fields, and they crossed paths one evening near the well behind the main kitchen. He looked at her with those serious eyes and said, in a dialect close enough to her own that she felt her chest crack open with something she had not felt since Angola. Recognition. "You are far from home," he said. "So are you," she said back. It was not a love story that unfolded slowly and gently. There was no room for that in Greyfield Estate. What grew between Esperanza and Wayme was something harder and more permanent than romance. It was alliance. It was the decision, made quietly, between 2 people who had survived unsurvivable things, that they would not survive alone anymore. They began to talk. Not in front of others, not in the open. In small, stolen moments, near the well, behind the smokehouse, during the brief hours when the estate's surveillance loosened. Wayme told her things about the field operations, the schedules of the overseers, the layout of the back roads that led away from the estate. She told him things about the house, the patterns of the men, the rhythms of the monthly meetings. What neither of them said out loud, not for years, was what they were building toward. But they both knew. The first time Esperanza seriously considered killing Edmund Greyfield was in the fall of 1707. A young man named Tobias, 17 years old and recently arrived from Barbados, had been caught trying to run. He had made it barely 3 miles before the dogs found him. Greyfield assembled every person on the estate in the front courtyard to witness what happened next. He stood on the steps of the main house, completely calm, and delivered a punishment so methodical and deliberate that several of the other enslaved people looked away. Greyfield did not look away from any of them. He watched each face in the crowd. He was not punishing Tobias. He was sending a message to 200 people at once. This was theater. He understood it as theater. Esperanza did not look away either. She stood in the crowd and watched Greyfield's face, and she saw something she had suspected for years, but never confirmed until that moment. He was not angry. He was not even particularly engaged. He was performing a function he considered routine. Tobias was not a person to him. Tobias was a maintenance problem being solved. That night, Esperanza sat by the small window of her sleeping quarters and stayed awake until the birds began, and she made a decision that would take 9 more years to execute. She was going to need time. She was going to need knowledge. She was going to need the kind of patience that most people are not built for. But she had always been built differently. The years between 1707 and 1716 were not empty years. They were the years of architecture. Esperanza built something during that time that had no name, no formal structure, no headquarters. She built a network of information, passed in whispers and glances, assembled from fragments overheard and details observed. Wame extended her reach into the fields. A woman named Clara, who worked in the laundry, gave her access to the guest quarters during the monthly meetings. A young man named Amos, who worked the stables, told her exactly which horses belonged to which men and how quickly those horses could be made unavailable. She did not rush. This was the quality in Esperanza that no one who underestimated her could ever account for. She did not rush. She planned the way a river plans its course, not in a straight line, patiently around every obstacle, wearing down stone over years, finding the path that would eventually carry the entire weight of everything she had endured. And she waited for the moment that would tell her it was time. That moment came on a cold morning in March of 1716. She was carrying linens down the second-floor hallway of the main house when she heard Edmund Greyfield speaking to his estate manager behind the closed door of his study. His voice was unhurried, the way his voice always was. He was discussing the upcoming season's operations. He was discussing costs and adjustments. And then, in the same tone he might use to discuss the rotation of crops, he said Esperanza's name. She stopped moving. "She's too valuable in the house," the estate manager said. "She's been in the house 15 years, Greyfield said. "She's not producing anything. I've been too sentimental about her efficiency. Starting next season, I want her reassigned. We need numbers." There was a pause. "You understand what I'm saying," Greyfield said. "Yes, sir," the estate manager said. Esperanza stood in the hallway with the linens in her arms and breathed slowly, in through the nose, out through the mouth. Her hands were perfectly still. Her face did not move. She counted to 10. Then she walked down the hallway, folded the linens into a cabinet, and went to find Wame. "It is time," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "How long?" he asked. 90 days, she said. And for the first time in 15 years, Wame allowed himself to believe they were actually going to do it. 90 days. That was what Esperanza had given herself. 90 days between the moment she heard Edmund Greyfield erase her humanity with a single sentence and the moment she intended to make him understand, in the most permanent way possible, what that erasure had cost him. She did not panic. She did not weep. She walked back to her work that morning and completed every task assigned to her with the same quiet precision she had maintained for 15 years. She folded linens. She polished silver. She served dinner without spilling a single drop. And while her hands moved through the familiar rhythms of a life that had been forced upon her, her mind was somewhere else entirely, moving through a different kind of architecture, checking walls for weakness, testing floors for weight. That night she found Wame near the east fence, where the old oak tree split into 2 trunks and created a narrow darkness that the overseer's lanterns never quite reached. "They're going to reassign me," she said. "Next season." Wame's jaw tightened. He understood immediately what reassignment meant. He had seen other women disappear into it. He had watched them come back different, or not come back at all. "Then we move before next season," he said. "We move on the June meeting," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "All 14? "All 14, she said. Another silence. Longer this time. "Esperanza," he said slowly. 14 men is not a plan. 14 men is a war. Then it is a war, she said. He looked at her for a long time in that narrow darkness. He had known this woman for 13 years. He had watched her build patience the way other people build walls, brick by brick, without hurry, without visible emotion. He had believed in her longer than he had believed in almost anything. But 14 men in one night, in one room, under the nose of an entire estate. He needed to hear how.
He needed to know the plan was real and not the desperation of a woman who had finally run out of road.
"Tell me everything," he said. And she did. For the first time in 15 years of silence, Esperanza de Lima told someone everything. It took 2 hours. She laid out the architecture of what she had been building since 1707, and as she spoke, Wayme's expression moved through something she had never seen on his face before. It moved from concern to attention, to something that looked, by the end of it, almost like awe. "You've been planning this since Tobias?" he said. "I have been planning this since the auction block," she said. He exhaled slowly. Then he straightened his spine and said, "Tell me what you need from me." And just like that, the war had 2 generals. The first thing Esperanza needed was the plant.
She had known about it for years, a knowledge carried from Angola in the same part of her memory that held her mother's songs and her village's water. A root, dried and ground fine as dust, that produced no smell, no color, no taste when dissolved in liquid. In large enough quantities, it produced deep unconsciousness within 20 minutes of consumption. In the right dose, it did nothing more than that. She was not interested in poison. Poison was too quick. She needed these men conscious. She needed them fully aware of what was happening to them and why. She needed them to understand. A woman named Mercy, who worked the kitchen garden and had survived 30 years on 3 different plantations, knew exactly what Esperanza was asking for when she described the root without naming her purpose. Mercy looked at her for a long moment. Her eyes were ancient, heavy with things she had seen and never been permitted to speak about. "How much do you need?" Mercy asked. "Enough for 14 men, Esperanza said. Mercy did not ask a single question more. She turned back to her garden and said without looking up, "Come back Thursday after the evening bell." The root was ready by Thursday. The second thing Esperanza needed was time in the coal furnace room. The furnace on Greyfield Estate was massive, one of the largest in the Low Country, built to dry and process the rice harvest. It sat in a stone outbuilding 30 yards behind the main house. At night, between harvest seasons, it was cold and empty and completely unguarded. Amos, who managed the stables and whose loyalty to Esperanza had been cemented years ago after she had once covered his absence during a night he had spent with a woman on a neighboring estate, secured her 3 uninterrupted hours in that building over 2 separate nights in May. What Esperanza did during those hours, she did alone. When she came out the second night, she stood in the dark for a moment and breathed the cool air with her eyes closed. When she opened them, she found Wayme waiting. "Is it ready?" he said. "It is ready," she said. The third thing she needed was the cotton, raw cotton. 17 pounds of it, pulled from the processing shed in small amounts over 6 weeks, hidden in places that only she knew about. When Wayme asked her what the cotton was for, she told him. His expression did not change, but something moved behind his eyes, something that was partly horror and partly a cold, hard understanding that the woman standing in front of him had thought through every detail of this night with a thoroughness that went beyond strategy. It was almost liturgical, almost like a ceremony she had been rehearsing in her mind for 9 years. "The cotton gag," he said quietly. "They silenced us with it for 100 years, she said. It felt like the right choice. He had no answer for that. June arrived the way South Carolina summers always arrived, without apology, pressing heat into everything and everyone. The estate moved at its standard rhythm. The Rice Council meeting was confirmed for June 23rd, the same Thursday it always was.
14 men sent their confirmations. 14 horses would be tied at the east post. 14 men would expect to eat well and drink well and conduct their business in the room where they had conducted it every first Thursday for as long as anyone could remember. Esperanza spent the week before the meeting in a state of absolute surface calm. She completed her duties. She smiled when smiling was expected of her. She responded to instructions with the quiet efficiency that Edmund Greyfield had taken for granted for 15 years. On the inside, she was checking and rechecking every piece of the plan, running through it the way a watchmaker examines a mechanism, pressing every gear to confirm it held. On the night of June 22nd, the night before the meeting, she could not sleep. She lay on her back and stared at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of the estate settling into silence around her. She thought about Angola. She thought about the ship crossing, the 47 days of it, the darkness of the hold, the sounds she would never fully stop hearing. She thought about the auction block and Edmund Greyfield's eyes moving over her like she was a table he was considering purchasing. She thought about Tobias, 17 years old, and the expression on his face as he understood what was about to happen to him. She thought about the 7-year-old boy and the rod and the laughter of 14 men with glasses in their hands. She thought about her mother's voice. She thought about the word her mother used to say to her when she was very small and afraid of things in the dark. The word from home. The word that meant, "I am here. You are not alone. The thing that is coming cannot take everything." She said that word to herself once, very quietly, in the dark of her quarters. Then she closed her eyes. And when she opened them, it was June 23rd, 1716. By 9 in the morning, the first carriages were arriving at Greyfield Estate. By noon, all 14 men had settled into the meeting room. Esperanza moved between the kitchen and the room in the precise, invisible way she had perfected over 15 years, carrying trays, removing dishes, refilling cups. The men talked about rice prices. They talked about the upcoming harvest season. Harlan Dutton made a joke that made the room erupt with laughter. Edmund Greyfield sat at the head of the table and presided over all of it, with the satisfied expression of a man who believed completely that the world was arranged exactly as it should be. He had never in 15 years looked at the woman filling his cup long enough to notice her hands. He did not notice them now. Perfectly still. At precisely 1 in the afternoon, Esperanza carried the afternoon drinks into the room on a large tray. The mixture in each cup had been prepared that morning. The proportions were exact. She had practiced the amounts 4 times over the preceding weeks on herself in tiny doses to verify the timing. 20 minutes from first full consumption. She had confirmed it as reliably as any apothecary could have confirmed it. She set a cup in front of each man. 14 cups, 14 men. Not one of them looked at her. "More wine," Dutton said to the room, not to her. "Of course," she said, to no one in particular, to the air. She stood near the door and waited. At 22 minutes past 1 in the afternoon, the first man slumped forward. By 1:30, all 14 were unconscious at the table. The room was completely silent. Esperanza stood in the doorway of that room for exactly 11 seconds. She looked at these 14 men who had run the machinery of suffering for decades. She looked at Edmund Greyfield's face, slack and unguarded for perhaps the first time in his adult life. Then she went to find Wayne. Wayne was waiting at the back door of the main house, exactly where she had told him to be. He had 3 others with him, not soldiers, not warriors in any formal sense of the word, just people who had endured enough that when Esperanza had come to them, one by one, over the preceding weeks, and told them what she was planning, not one of them had said no. Clara from the laundry, Amos from the stables, and an old man named Solomon, who had been on Greyfield Estate longer than anyone alive could remember, who had buried 3 of his own children in the estate's back field, and who, when Esperanza told him the plan, simply nodded once and said, I have been waiting for someone to do this since 1689.
Esperanza looked at all four of them standing at that back door and said only one thing. They are down. We have maybe 3 hours before the first one starts coming back. Let's move. They moved.
The first body they carried out of the meeting room was Harlan Dutton. He was the heaviest man at the table, thick through the chest and shoulders, a man who had eaten well for 60 years on the labor of people he considered beneath consideration. It took Wayne and Amos together to drag him through the back hallway, through the kitchen, out the rear door, and across the 30 yards to the stone outbuilding that housed the coal furnace. Solomon held the door.
Clara kept watch on the path between the main house and the field quarters, ready to signal if anyone approached. 11 more trips. Esperanza did not stand back and direct. She worked alongside Wayne, shoulder to shoulder, carrying weight that most people would have considered beyond her. She did not grunt. She did not slow. She moved with the focused, contained energy of someone who had been saving this effort for 15 years and had more than enough left to spend. Edmund Greyfield was the last one they brought through. Esperanza carried him herself. Not entirely. Wayne had his legs, but she had his shoulders, her hands gripping the fabric of his coat, and as they moved him through the back hallway, she looked down at his slack, unconscious face and felt something she had not expected to feel. Not satisfaction. Not yet. Something quieter and more complicated. Something that felt almost like grief. The grief of a woman who had spent the best years of her life in a place that had tried to convince her she had no years worth grieving. She set him down in the furnace room and straightened up and rolled her shoulders back. "Bind them," she said. Wayne had the rope. He had prepared it in the weeks before, cut to lengths, coiled and stored in the stable loft where no one went except Amos. They worked quickly and without conversation, binding wrists behind backs with the tight, practiced knots of people who understood that there would be no second chance if a single one of these men got a hand free. When the last knot was tied, Esperanza stood in the center of the furnace room and looked at 14 men arranged in a stone floor around the cold furnace. 14 men who had run the Low Country like a private empire.
14 men who had treated human beings as equipment. 14 men who had laughed. She reached into the folded cloth she had brought from the house and began placing the raw cotton, one gag for each man. She worked methodically, moving from one to the next, and when she was done, she stood back and looked at what she had made. The silence in that room was the loudest thing she had ever heard. Then, from somewhere in the circle, one of the men began to stir. It was not Greyfield. It was a younger man, Thomas Aldridge, 29 years old, the newest member of the Rice Council, who had apparently consumed less of the drink than the others. His eyelids fluttered. His hands moved instinctively against the rope and found it immovable. His eyes came open fully, and he looked at the stone ceiling above him, and then turned his head and saw Esperanza standing there. For a moment, he simply stared at her. His mind was still working through the fog of the root mixture, assembling the information in front of him into a picture that made no sense within the world as he understood it. Then he tried to speak and discovered the cotton. His body went rigid with panic. He pulled against the rope, hard, and the sound he made through the gag was the sound of a man who had just understood something fundamental about his situation. Esperanza watched him without moving. She let him work through it. She let him feel the rope, feel the gag, feel the cold stone under him, feel the absolute unresponsiveness of his circumstances to anything he was trying to do about them. When he stopped pulling and lay still, breathing hard through his nose, she crouched down to his level and looked him in the eyes. "Now you know what it feels like," she said, "to call for help and have no one come." She stood back up. By 2:30 in the afternoon, 7 of the 14 men were conscious. By 3, all of them were awake.
The furnace room had become a contained theater of panic, 14 men pulling against rope, communicating nothing through their gags but raw animal fear, their eyes moving frantically between each other and the woman who stood at the center of all of it, completely still, watching them with an expression that was not rage and not triumph and not madness. It was something far more unsettling than any of those things. It was patience. Edmund Greyfield came back to consciousness last. Esperanza had expected this. She had given him the largest dose. She had wanted him awake for as long as possible. She had things she needed him to understand. When his eyes opened and found her face, she saw the precise moment that Edmund Greyfield understood who had done this. She saw him search her face for something, confusion or apology, or the flicker of madness that might make this explicable to him, and find none of those things. Find only the same quiet woman who had refilled his cup for 15 years, standing over him in his own furnace room, looking at him with absolute clarity. He made a sound through the cotton gag that was trying to be her name. "Yes," she said. "It's me." She let that sit with him for a full minute. Then she walked to the furnace and lit the coal. The fire took slowly at first, the way coal always does. It does not roar to life the way wood does. It builds. It deepens. It radiates in waves that start small and grow by degrees. Esperanza had known this. She had planned for this. The furnace at Greyfield Estate, burning at full heat, would raise the temperature of that stone room by degrees over the course of many hours. It would not be quick. It had never been designed to be quick. Coal furnaces were built for endurance, for sustained, reliable, manageable heat. Justice burns slower than coal, she thought, but burns complete. The men understood what the lit furnace meant before the first wave of heat reached them. The collective sound that went through the room in the moments after she struck the light was something that had no name in any language Esperanza knew. It was the sound of men who had spent their lives in complete control of every variable around them, suddenly confronting a variable they could not manage, negotiate, purchase, or intimidate into compliance. Greyfield's eyes never left her face. She looked back at him. She did not look away. "In March," she said, her voice even, conversational, the voice she had used for 15 years when addressing him. "You told your estate manager that I was no longer producing anything useful, that you had been too sentimental." She paused. "I want you to know that I heard that. I want you to know that everything that is happening right now began in that hallway." He was making sounds through the gag, urgent, desperate sounds. She continued as if he had not made them. "You bought me in 1701. I was 19 years old. I had a name before you bought me. I had a family. I had a home. You did not ask about any of those things. You looked at my hands and said, 'This one,' and that was the entirety of what I was to you for 15 years. Her voice stayed completely level. "I want you to understand that I am not doing this because I am a violent person. I am doing this because you left me no other language you were capable of hearing." She turned from him then. She walked to the door. Behind her, the furnace continued its slow, absolute work. She found Wayne outside the door, standing in the late afternoon heat, and he looked at her face when she came out and did not ask her anything. He simply stood beside her. After a long moment, she reached over and took his hand, and he held it, and they stood there together in the fading light of June 23rd, 1716, listening to the world they had known for 15 years rearrange itself permanently around them. Clara appeared at the edge of the path, her voice low and urgent. "Esperanza, someone is coming up the east road." Esperanza did not move immediately. She felt Wayne's grip tighten on her hand. "How many?" she asked. "One rider," Clara said. "Alone." Esperanza let go of Wame's hand. She straightened her back. She turned toward the East Road with the same expression she had worn at the auction block in 1701, the silence of a woman who had already decided something irreversible. Whatever was coming up that road, she had made her peace with it long before tonight. She had made her peace with all of it in 1707, standing in a courtyard, watching a 17-year-old boy and memorizing the face of the man responsible.
She picked up the knife from the ground where she had set it. She began to sharpen it. Old habit. Her hands needed something to do when her mind was working. The rider came closer, and Esperanza de Lima stood her ground and waited, the way she had always waited, with a stillness that the whole world had mistaken for submission, and that had never, not for a single day, been anything of the kind. The rider was a boy,
no older than 16, one of the estate's errand runners, sent from a neighboring plantation with a letter for Edmund Greyfield confirming attendance at next month's Rice Council meeting. He pulled his horse to a stop, looked at the woman standing in the path with a knife in her hands, and felt something in his chest tell him to turn around. He turned around. Esperanza watched him ride back down the East Road until the dust settled behind him. Then she looked at Clara.
"He'll talk,"
Clara said. "Yes," Esperanza said. "He will." She turned back toward the furnace building and stood there for a moment, listening. The sounds coming from inside had changed in quality over the past 2 hours. Lower now, more exhausted. The coal furnace at Greyfield Estate was doing exactly what it had been built to do. Slow, sustained, complete. Wayne came to stand beside her. His voice was quiet when he spoke. "We need to decide what happens next," he said. "For us. For Clara and Amos and Solomon." Esperanza had been thinking about this since March. She had planned the night with the same precision she had planned everything else, but she had always understood that the night itself was only one half of the architecture. The other half was what came after. What you did with the window that the night opened before the world closed it again. "Solomon goes to his daughter in the North Quarter," she said. "He is old enough and known well enough that they will assume he was nowhere near this building tonight. Clara goes back to the laundry. Same reason." She paused. "Amos takes the 2 fastest horses from the stable and leaves them at the creek crossing 2 miles east. Then he goes back to the stable and he stays there." "And us?" Wayne said. She looked at him. This man who had stood beside her for 13 years in the dark and the heat and the silence of a life that had been taken from both of them. This man who had held her hand outside a furnace building on the worst and most necessary night of both their lives. "There is a ship," she said. "Portuguese merchant. Docked at Charlestown until Saturday morning. I have been in contact with the first mate for 6 weeks. Whamey stared at her. "You planned an exit," he said.
"I planned everything," she said.
He exhaled, long and slow. Then something moved across his face that was the closest thing to a smile she had seen from him in years. "Of course you did," he said. By 9 o'clock that night, Solomon was back in the North Quarter, sitting outside his door under the stars, whittling a piece of wood the way he did every evening, visible to anyone who cared to look. Clara had returned to the laundry building and was asleep, or performing sleep with enough convincing detail that the 2 overseers who walked past her door an hour later reported nothing unusual. Amos had the horses at the creek crossing and was back in the stable before the night watchman made his second round. Esperanza and Wame left Greyfield Estate on foot, moving through the rice fields in the dark, along a path she had memorized 2 years earlier, walking without a lantern, navigating by the sound of the creek and the position of stars her mother had taught her to read when she was small. They did not speak. They moved the way people move when they have said everything that needed saying, and the only thing left is the distance between here and somewhere else. It took them 4 hours to reach the creek crossing. The horses were there, both of them. Amos had chosen well. Esperanza mounted without hesitation and turned the horse toward Charlestown. The last thing she looked back at, before the road curved and Greyfield Estate disappeared behind the tree line, was the faint orange glow that was visible in the distance against the black sky. She turned away from it. She did not look back again. They reached Charlestown before dawn. The Portuguese merchant ship, the Santa Redenção, sat at the south dock, exactly where the first mate had told her it would be. A man named Carvalho met them at the gangway, looked at both of them, looked at the horses, and said nothing except, "Below deck, now." They went below. The ship left with the morning tide. It was June 24th, 1716. 3 days later, an estate hand sent to Greyfield with a delivery found the coal furnace building and raised an alarm that reached the Charlestown Colonial Authority by nightfall. The investigator assigned to the case, a man named Whitmore, arrived at Greyfield Estate on the morning of June 27th with 6 militiamen and spent 4 hours inside that stone building before coming back out. He was not a man known for visible emotion. People who knew him said he had seen every variety of human darkness the colony had produced and remained unmoved by all of it. He came out of the furnace building on June 27th and sat down on the ground and did not stand up again for 20 minutes. What he had found inside was 14 men arranged in a perfect circle, their charred remains bound at the wrists, their mouths stopped with raw cotton that had burned along with everything else. At the center of the circle, the furnace had gone cold. The coal had burned down to nothing, complete. The official investigation lasted 6 days. The colonial authority questioned every person on the estate. Clara answered every question with the calm of a woman who had washed other people's linens for 30 years and had a documented history of spending her evenings in the laundry building. Amos described his whereabouts with a specificity that 3 different witnesses confirmed. Solomon, an old man with a walking stick and no apparent motive that anyone in the colonial authority was equipped to imagine, was not seriously considered. No one found the root mixture. Mercy had seen to that before sunrise on June 24th. No one found the rope cuttings. No one found anything inside Greyfield's main house that told a story different from the one the estate's surviving workers told with consistent, practiced uniformity. 14 powerful men had arrived for a meeting. They had eaten and drunk, and then, sometime in the afternoon of June 23rd, something had happened that no one on the estate could explain. Whitmore wrote in his official report that the most disturbing aspect of his investigation was not the physical evidence, but a statement given to him by a field hand named Marcus, who, when asked what he knew about the events of June 23rd, replied simply, "I know that God is not always slow." Whitmore crossed that line out of his report. Then he wrote it back in. The colonial authorities sealed the official records of what they called the Greyfield incident within 2 weeks of the investigation. The reasoning was stated plainly in a closed session. If the full details of what one enslaved woman had accomplished against 14 of the most powerful men in the Low Country became widely known among the enslaved population of South Carolina, the consequences for the plantation system would be, in the words of one official, incalculable. They buried the paperwork. They told the families of the 14 men a version of events that described a fire of undetermined origin. They moved quickly to appoint new leadership for the Rice Council and to present publicly a face of untroubled order. But information does not obey sealed records. By the fall of 1716, the story of what had happened at Greyfield Estate on June 23rd had moved through the enslaved communities of South Carolina's Low Country in the way that fire moves through dry grass, person to person, whispered at wells and in field rows, and in the dark hours before dawn when the overseers slept. The details changed with each telling, as they always do. But certain things remained constant in every version. A woman, 15 years of silence, 14 men, a furnace, and a patience so deep and so sustained
that it had rearranged the world around it through sheer force of endurance. The name Esperanza de Lima moved with the story. In some versions, she became larger than a single person. She became an idea, something you could call on in the dark.
Something that lived in the space between endurance and action, in the place where a person decides that what is being done to them is not the end of the story. As for Esperanza herself, the colonial authorities' official position was that she had died at sea. This was based on a report from a Spanish trading vessel that claimed to have encountered a woman matching her description who was lost overboard during a storm in the Atlantic. The report was thin on detail and thick on convenience, and most historians who have subsequently examined it consider it a fiction constructed by parties who found a dead Esperanza de Lima considerably less complicated to manage than a living one. What actually happened to her after the Santa Redenção left Charlestown Harbor on the morning of June 24, 1716, is a question that has no definitive answer. There are fragments. A record in Lisbon from 1719 of a woman named Esperanza who gave testimony to a church court regarding conditions in the American colonies. A notation in a Brazilian port registry from 1722 of two passengers, a man and a woman traveling together, their names recorded in the handwriting of a clerk who may or may not have spelled them accurately. A grave marker in the interior of Angola, discovered in the early 20th century, that bears a name and a date, and beneath the date, a single sentence carved in Portuguese. The sentence reads, "She came home." Whether that grave belongs to Esperanza de Lima, no one can say with certainty. But the people who found it, the descendants of the village she had been taken from in 1701, treated it as hers. They kept it clean. They placed things on it. They told their children the story of the woman whose name was on it, the story of what she had endured and what she had ultimately done about it. And those children told their children, and the story moved forward through time, the way all stories move that are too heavy and too true to be put down. Back in South Carolina, the Rice Council reconstituted itself within a year. New men took the seats of the 14 who had died. The plantation system continued. The machinery of suffering ground on for another 147 years before it was finally, incompletely, and at enormous cost, dismantled. But something had changed, not visibly, not in any way the colonial authority could measure or document or contain. Something had changed in the understanding of what was possible, in the knowledge carried quietly through the years by the people who had the most reason to carry it, that patience was not the same thing as acceptance. That silence was not the same thing as surrender. That a woman who had been told for 15 years that she was nothing had looked 14 powerful men in the eyes and shown them, in the most permanent language available to her, exactly how wrong they had been. Solomon died in the winter of 1718. He was found one morning sitting in his usual spot outside his door, his whittling knife in his hand, his eyes closed. The people who found him said he looked like a man who had finished something he had been working on for a very long time and had put his tools down and rested. Clara worked at Greyfield Estate for another 12 years, until the estate was sold and its operations dissolved. She never spoke publicly about June 23, 1716, but in the years that followed, younger women on the estate sought her out with the particular wordless urgency of people who needed to know that resistance was possible without being told so in direct terms. She never confirmed anything to them, but she never denied anything either. And Amos, who had lived his whole life in a stable that belonged to a man who considered him property, was recorded in the estate's transfer documents in 1728 as having been given his freedom by the estate's new owner, a detail so unusual for the period that the historian who found it spent 3 months trying to understand how it had happened. He never found an explanation, only the fact of it, sitting in the record like a stone that had no business being there,
solid and immovable and real.
Esperanza de Lima had planned everything, even that.
Justice burns slower than coal, she had said to the investigators who found her in that furnace room on the morning after. Said it calmly, with a knife in her hands and a lullaby on her lips, looking at them with the eyes of a woman who had already finished her work and had nothing left to hide. But Burns complete